Thank you. So in Jenny Mansbridge's very illuminating slide about the original Habermasian conditions of high-quality deliberation, how they've been modified, she mentioned one new criterion, which is epistemic, the epistemic value of deliberation. One thing that she left out, and then for which I think is overwhelming evidence, is that PowerPoints tend to worsen the quality of deliberation. So I'm going to be doing without a PowerPoint for my comments. It's a really lovely paper. It's one of the most enjoyable reading experiences I've had in quite some time. I really recommend it.
Even compared to the New York Times.
And I'll say a bit more in my comments about what I really enjoyed about it. I'm going to make 3 points. The first 2 are basically about the paper. The third is about the paper, but then takes off from it to a certain extent. The first point is really methodological, and this is really something I'd like to take from the paper and bring back to my colleagues. And it's unfortunate that a couple of the people who are on the operational side of our institution couldn't stay. But the methodological point is that there's really no substitute for the direct observation of social practice. We do a lot of data collection here in the institution, and a lot of it's about surveys and opinions and this kind of thing, and even the focus groups. But you can't really get at the point that they really very persuasively demonstrate about the way in which formal deliberative contexts replicate the school environment without being there and observing both of those experiences. You can't simply ask people, well, do you think school is like this? Well, you can't really ask them, do you value deliberation? Should people be equal? You can't understand this without actually looking at the way in which meanings are embedded in the social practical experience. And the paper really brings that out very, very effectively. The second point I want to make is that it's about the division, I think a very useful division, between different kinds of context. That's right, institutional settings. Context is the right word. Formal, what they call community governance, and then the informal. And they presented that just now, reversed, in reversed order. And what comes out from the paper is that, well, the paper is presented in increasing levels of deliberative quality, right? Or as in their presentation, it was in decreasing levels of deliberative quality. In formal settings, you basically have very little because you're doing rote memorization and doing what important people tell you to do, or think that they want you to do. In the community governance settings, there's some things that one would recognize as deliberation, but it tends to be individualized, when a chief acts in his adjudicative role, or it tends to involve only insiders. And then finally, in the informal setting, you have things are more open. You have sort of people arguing on a bus, about the causes of AIDS. You have sort of people trying to protect a woman who's being beaten up and arguing about it. So that's what we observe. And then the question is why? And the suggestion in the paper, I don't think it's it's quite direct, is that there's something about status inequalities, mysticization of education and status, and the sort of myth of the modern and its relationship to power that explains this. And if that's the case, the first thought I had was, well, maybe we have this all backwards, we meaning the development community. When we go out and do CDD, we try and structure the environment. We sort of say, okay, you guys, let's do it for 2 hours, let's include men and women, let's make sure everyone has a chance to speak, let's have a rapporteur, let's have something, done at the end. And by creating, these conditions of ideal speech, we're actually doing what is wrong, right? Because then this brings in that fear of the modern and all that stuff. So maybe, if this line of reasoning is right, the suggestion would be saying, just tell us, go count, here, I'm a task team leader. We're going to spend the money. I'm going to come back in in a month, and just tell me, whatever informal method you want to use. But the suggestion maybe let's not structure this. Let's let the informal dominate. So that's sort of interpretation A. Interpretation B, for why this is the case, is that it's precisely in these informal areas where resource distributions are not at stake, at least not in any obvious way. So it may be when people argue on a bus about what the causes of AIDS, or when they sort of like try and protect someone spontaneously. It's not as if they're trying to decide, what to do with this, who gets to join the seed club, or how the land should be divided, or even in the formal setting, who gets to go on a training. Those are two interpretations that both potentially explain that. The paper doesn't provide, I think, any solid evidence for adjudicating between those two possibilities. I tend towards B, based on priors, I suppose, that if in fact we actually put resources at stake and didn't structure the deliberative context, it would by itself be structured on behalf of those interests who are most able to commandeer those resources. So a thought there. The general question is, why do we find this varying, what is the cause of this correlation between formalization and worsening deliberative quality? And it may be that resources aren't at stake in any obvious way. Okay, the third point is that I wanted to talk a little bit about publicity. And this is in some way a reference or a plug to a recent paper that I've written. I won't say it's a shameless plug because I do feel somewhat embarrassed about bringing it up, but obviously not so embarrassed as to not mention this paper. It's about the role of publicity in customary law. And and I guess I would approach this by saying that in Anne and Susan's paper, what counts as deliberation is not explicit. Implicitly, what they seem to be getting at is something like direct expression of interests, confrontation, something along those lines. That's the marker of deliberation. Obviously, there are other markers of deliberation, and I thought Jenny's slide mentioned some of those. The one I want to focus on is publicity, and what I mean by that is sort of wide accessibility of legal justification or normative justification. Can lots of people access that justification, understand it, even hear it and then understand it? And this is important for the theorists, right? I know for Habermas, to get certain kind of equality, you need public autonomy, private autonomy, rule of law, but you also need what he calls communicative power, like us coming together and understanding each other, right? And so that this requires a generation of a language in which a community can understand itself as a voluntary association, a free and equal confederates under the law, right? It's also important for Rawls in his later work, so that you have to be able to not impugn the reasonability of others, right? You sort of accept that when you have disagreements, there are these burdens of judgment, and you just might disagree, and that's okay, and you've got to be able to sort of understand what constitutes an acceptable argument and propose and live that way, and abide by it if other people do as well. So, it might be somewhat odd to sort of use these guys to talk about Malawi, but I don't think it's entirely wrong. So then the goal then really is to try to create a common language for the normative justification, right? How would you do this? You could reference other cases. In the paper, they talk about a fund of stories that are drawn on for this. And there may be a way to sort of make this more explicit, right? One can imagine interventions along these lines. Judicial training to get some of these chiefs to sort of actually learn about giving decisions. NGO advocacy to get people to ask for justification. Rules in the way that these customary courts are governed in the formal system, which is, they often have some formal structure. Then finally, inducements for dispute resolvers to get together and hash out tough cases, right? So there are ways to conceivably do this. Obviously, these aren't going to be perfect, because as they mentioned, there are still formidable structural obstacles, the whole inequality in the society, the history of slavery. They mentioned the dictatorship, the patron-client structure. So this isn't going to go all the way, obviously, but maybe it could be a step in that direction. And I think the cases themselves present opportunities to think this way. If you think about the case about these two women, it's a horrifying case in which these two women beat up, a wife and her friend beat up a girlfriend. She's left, half naked, bruised, battered. At the end of that case, one guy says, well, stuff happens when stuff happens when you do this kind of thing. And another person says, well, maybe not. I don't know. I mean, it shouldn't be that way. But what really leaps off the page is the whole issue of proportionality, right? And I think this juxtaposition of these two comments leaves that open. Okay, this might be somewhat wrong in some context, but was this proportional to the extent of violation. And it seems to me those speakers may have that thought in their mind. The discussion of proportionality also arises when this rude woman, Miss Diamond, is expelled from a village. Okay, she's rude, whatever, but she need to be expelled, So that would be a widely accessible standard that people could talk about that maybe might be useful in generating publicity. There is a discussion of a young brother trying to marry his older brother's widow, right? And there's an explicit discussion of this tradition, chakolo, something like that, in which one marries one's widow, yeah. But then the discussion is really first about, well, we shouldn't do chakolo because there's AIDS, right? And it doesn't quite make sense. But then later, what really is dispositive for those reasoners in that discussion is that this person isn't really doing chakolo. He's just grabbing stuff, He's not being authentic to the tradition. So one could have a deliberative discussion of what chakolo means, right, in that environment, which would be another kind of like making this more widely accessible, this sort of standard. There's a discussion of what we would call public accommodation, in terms of whether an AIDS sufferer should join a seed-sharing club. And then there's this interesting story about the parents who go to the teachers and say, why are our kids kicked out of school for having sex? And that is really interesting because on the one hand, the teacher's response is, we're just doing what the ministry tells us. These are the rules, you agreed to it, we have to do it, we have no choice. And then the parents, they get, the headman sort of like chastises them for like being arrogant, for acting out of turn, right? So these are two forms of acting out of turn, right? The legal term would be acting ultra vires, beyond authority of law. The teachers are saying, we can't do this. The headman saying to the teachers, well, you're not in a position to do this. That's an opportunity to discuss what it means to act out of one's authority. Is it based on elder stuff or is it based on law? I'm getting the move on symbol. So I will wrap up by saying one last thing, which is that in the paper, there's an interesting discussion of the constituent elements of being a good chief, right? Being a good chief means maintaining harmony in the community. It means organizing the production of public goods and brings development. So the suggestion here is that there may also be constituent elements of these various social and political practices, chokolo, acting out of turn, proportionality, which can be identified and which certain interventions might actually allow the discussion of, which in turn might enhance deliberative quality along the dimension of publicity.